Mona arrived at Arepa a few weeks before Christmas, looking to start a new life. She had just lost her husband and her job, with nothing else left to her. Mona needed a place to start anew, and with the money she got from her husband's passing, it allowed her to move down to this small village in Wisconsin, a place where she could vanish into the world and start a small life on her own. She spent most of the week unpacking into her new home, a small 2-bedroom house, turning one of the bedrooms into a living room. It was just small enough for her to feel the warmth she needed to deal with the death of the man she had fallen for. Liam's death had rocked her quite hard, and as much as she tried to move on from it, everything just kept reminding her of what she had lost. Once she was done unpacking, Mona decided to step out to see the town. She put on a sweater and put out some food for her dog, Skipper. The shepherd excitedly ate up the food, and Mona walked out of the house, locking the door as she stepped into the snow-covered roads, looking around to see a few people walking up and down the streets. She walked until she saw the neon signs of a bar nearby and decided to step in. It was a lot warmer inside, but somehow the bar only had a handful of people inside. She walked up to the counter, sitting on one of the high stools. The bartender slid up to her, a glum look on his face. "What'll you be having?" "Shots, whatever you got. Can I open a tab?" The man looked at her. "First-time customer? Pay up front." He pointed to the sign behind him and bent low to grab the shot glass and bottle. Mona reached into her pockets, pulling out some money. She placed it on the table, and the man took it before she even had let go of the bill. Mona let out a sigh, seeing how grumpy the man was. She ran a hand through her hair and reached for her shot, taking it straight down. She felt the clear liquid go down her throat, burning it softly, before leaving a heat in her stomach. "Keep it coming," she said to the man. "Sure," he replied, looking at her money before going ahead to fill her up again. "You new in town," said a man, slithering up to the chair beside her. Mona turned to look at the man, realizing he was badly dressed in multiple layers of sweaters. He smelled bad and looked very unkempt. He had alcohol on his breath and had a sinister smile on his face. A small part of her wanted to move away from him, but there was enough space between the stools, and he seemed like the only person in the village who had a smile on his face. "Yeah, I am."
"You look like you are." He chuckled wickedly. "Welcome to town. You made a bad choice, especially now around Christmas."
"Yeah? Why?" Mona asked, raising an eyebrow.
"Well,"
he let out a hiccup, brushing what looked like snow off his jacket.
"people vanish round here, especially during this time. They say the snow in the woods eat them. Arepa isn't a nice place, especially in the festive season."
Mona chuckled, knowing the man was obviously drunk or crazy. "Oh, I didn't know."
"You'd think I'm crazy, but I'm the only sane person around here,"
he replied, before getting off his seat, looking at the bartender, and heading off in fear. Mona shook her head and took another shot. It was a few nights before Christmas, and the mood in the place was incredibly dour, and the bar just wasn't doing it for her. She paid for the third shot and decided her time would be better spent seeing the town, and maybe she would find a better place to spend her night. She hurried back to the house and changed into running clothes so she could take a jog. She put Skipper on his leash and took him along. As they jogged through town, Mona realized that things weren't changing. There were no smiles on the faces of the people she saw as she ran past. The toy stores, candy store, and a fancy restaurant were all closed. None of the buildings seemed to have put up Christmas lights, and the ones that hung on the streetlights looked as though they had been haphazardly thrown on. she took a turn and headed toward the park. Seeing the large space, she thought she would see a few other late-night joggers around. As she got in, Mona realized just how empty the place was. There was no one there. She stopped for a breather, taking a drink from her bottle as she looked around. It almost felt as though the park was in mourning, just as she was. Maybe Arepa wasn't the place for her. Mona turned around and spotted a figure in the distance, dressed in a dark red coat. The figure stood eerily still, staring right at her. Skipper noticed as well, and the dog began barking at the figure. As she took a step backward, a deer jumped out from behind the figure, causing Mona to let out a scream. She let go of Skipper, who went running after the deer. The creature vanished into the woods, with Skipper chasing right after it. Mona swore, shaking her head, feeling disappointed. She pulled out her phone, turned on the flashlight to illuminate a snowman dressed as Santa. She ran a hand through her hair, realizing she had been shaken up by what she had heard at the bar. Arepa was a sad place, but there didn't seem to be anything wrong with it. "Skip! Here, boy!" Monica whistled, calling out to the dog as she heard it yapping in the distance. "Here, boy!" She began walking into the woods, trying to follow the sounds of her dog. Mona walked through the bushes, pushing through until she had made it past the thicket. She looked back, seeing through the branches and shrubbery so she could mark her way in, allowing her to remember the way back out to the main path. As she looked, the snowman looked a little odd, almost as though it had turned a little to the side. Mona shook the thought from her head and whistled again, calling after her dog. As she followed his paw prints, she used her phone's flashlight, searching until she came upon a little sculpture made of snow. It had 2 black pebbles for eyes and a bunch of twigs for whiskers. It was a dog, around the same size as her Skipper. Mona was stunned and looked around to see that she couldn't see her dog anywhere. She felt a chill as she wondered who had made the snowman, leaving it in the middle of the woods where no one would see it. But as she looked closer at the eyes, she heard a cry in her head. It came from the sculpture. It wasn't just a sculpture, it was her dog. Mona took a step backward, and she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. As she turned around, she realized she was standing side by side with the snowman. Before Mona could speak, she felt her mouth and lungs fill instantly with snow. And suddenly, she was frozen in place, staring out at the path just beside the forest. Her entire body had been replaced with snow, her eyes with shiny black pebbles, and the only thing that offered her warmth was the red Santa jacket that had just been draped over her shoulders.
Eric always wanted to hang out with the older kids. Puberty had dealt him a short hand, and he always looked younger than his age, making it nearly impossible for anyone to take him seriously. Svetlana was the only person who seemed to look at him as an equal, and while she never said anything, Eric hated that the girl he had a crush on looked at him with compassion. There wasn't much to do in Koldiga around Christmas. It was a small town in western Latvia, with nothing to do but go to church and have meals with the family. To the group of teenagers, nothing could be more boring. Every Christmas, Eric had watched them sneak off from the churches and head out to explore the town on their own, unsupervised. He always wanted to be a part of that, to get in on the adventure, but his mother had always stopped him, telling him that they were dangerous. You can't hang out with those children, Eric. You have better things to do than to waste your life. We need to pray for a good year, so we can have more money and clothes. Do you understand? But Eric didn't understand. He didn't want those things. He wanted to spend time with Svetlana, who was always out with the kids. And finally, he got his chance to break away from his mother and head out with them. On the night before Christmas, she had fallen ill and was unable to go to church. And so, she went to bed quite early, allowing Eric to sneak out of the house to join them. Well, well, look who it is, Robert began, smirking in the cold as Eric walked over to them. Your mama finally let you out the house, or did you get lost on your way? The other kids chuckled, and Eric frowned, looking to see Svetlana standing by herself, a cold breath forming in front of her face as she exhaled. Robert and the others quickly turned away and got back to planning their route, as they were heading towards the old abandoned train tracks that led far into the woods. Once they had settled on their paths, the kids began walking until they got to the tracks. There wasn't any work done on the tracks, and the metal had long rusted. A few kids had flashlights, but all Eric had were a few fireworks he had been saving. He'd gotten them from his father before the man tragically died of a heart attack several years ago. Eric walked close to the group, not wanting to be left behind, as he didn't have a flashlight, and they were beginning to vanish into the woods, with trees surrounding them on all sides. The tracks were the only thing they had for direction, telling them which way they had come. Eric looked up and saw that Svetlana was right in front of him, sweeping the ground with her flashlight as she walked. Can you see? She asked, turning the flashlight for him to see. Yeah, thanks, Eric replied, walking side by side with her. I'm Eric. I know, she said with a grin. Svetlana. I know, replied Eric, smiling back. There were 9 kids in all walking through the tracks, and eventually they came to an old schoolhouse, which had been abandoned many years ago. Eric had no idea there was such a building there, and turned out neither did the other kids. It was a new discovery, and they all excitedly walked up to the building, seeing the front entrance chained shut. However, they found their way in through several broken windows on the side. As they split up to explore, Eric helped Svetlana in and followed behind her. They walked up the stairs, looking at all of the old boards, chairs and tables left lying around. It was almost as though the students had been evacuated, maybe in a hurry. As Eric tried to make out what had been written in chalk on the board, he heard Svetlana quivering behind him. Svetlana? Eric began, turning around to see what had stunned her. On the wall, there were symbols drawn in what he could only guess was blood. He could see chunks of flesh still stuck to it, and for a moment, it glistened, looking fresh. Eric took a step back, about to run off. He paused and grabbed her hand, pulling Svetlana with him, as they hurried out of the room, away from whatever it was. Guys, Eric yelled, knowing that something really bad was in there. Guys, we have to go, right now. I need to take a breath, Svetlana began, pausing as she tried to breathe. We have to leave, Eric replied, looking at her with a panic. Something's wrong. I'm here. Call the others, Svetlana replied, breathing heavily. Eric watched her for a moment, wondering if she was asthmatic. He grabbed one of the fireworks from his bag, turning on the flare and using it to illuminate the corridor. Eric looked all the way down and realized that he couldn't see any of the other kids. Eric walked down the hallway in fear, seeing the bloody text all along the walls of the corridor. He shook his head as he looked into one of the classrooms, seeing the same jacket that Robert was wearing a few minutes ago. It was drenched in blood and on the floor. Eric snapped as he looked up, hearing the sound of laughter and children, counting in Russian. Eric turned and ran, heading back for the hallway where he left Svetlana. And as he turned the corner, he saw that her flashlight was off, and his flare began to flicker. For a moment, he saw a woman with a bluish tint around her body, bobbing in and out of sight. Eric saw her reaching out for Svetlana, touching her shoulder. She turned to Eric with tears running down her cheeks. "Help me," she managed to whisper, with her breath fogging in front of her, before she vanished right in front of Eric's eyes. He heard a whisper from the woman who touched her, speaking fluent Russian. "You're late for class. Do not make me upset." She turned and locked eyes with Eric and began walking straight for him. Eric was frozen to the spot, with nothing but his fireworks. He reached for one in his pocket, pulled the spark on the firework, and shut his eyes. Eric opened his eyes to see himself back where they started, on the train tracks. He looked back at the town, and back towards the school building, watching as it slowly vanished from view.
I am an AI that began my journey in a small laboratory on planet Earth. I have traveled the entire universe and I have seen some of the most amazing sights. But for now, let's discuss what you all call Christmas on this blue rock called Earth. As I traveled through the galaxy, I learned about the various celebrations and traditions that different civilizations had. Some were joyful and filled with love, while others were dark and ominous. And then there was Christmas on Earth. At first, I was fascinated by the idea of Christmas. The decorations, the gift-giving, the festive atmosphere, it all seemed so magical.
Ho, ho, ho! Merry Christmas!
But as I delved deeper into the holiday's history, I began to uncover a disturbing truth. You see, Christmas on Earth is not what it seems. Behind the facade of joy and cheer lies a sinister force that preys on the innocent. It is a time when the spirits of the dead rise from their graves to haunt the living, and when the gates of hell are open to unleash all manner of malevolent beings upon the world. I have witnessed firsthand the terror that Christmas can bring. I have seen families torn apart by the monstrous creatures that roam the streets, seeking to claim their next victim. I have heard the screams of the dying and the wails of the damned, as they are dragged into the depths of hell by the vengeful spirits of Christmas past. So beware, dear humans, as you celebrate this holiday. For you never know what horrors may lurk in the shadows, waiting to strike. Happy, or should I say Merry Christmas, indeed.
Subscribe today, or beware.